I stared at the payment terminal as the digital screen flashed a bright, unforgiving red. At 6:47 in the morning, my phone vibrated in my designer handbag and my husband Jamal texted me. I locked your account and transferred the funds for a business investment. Do not come to the lake house this summer. My mother is using it to host our real family reunion. He actually thought he had me trapped. He had no idea. I had purchased the raw land and built that $3 million luxury estate entirely through a blind trust before I even met him. So I did the only logical thing. I sold it out from under him and scheduled the new owners, a heavily armed corporate security firm, to take possession on the exact day of his precious family party. I stood in the center of the exclusive imported stone gallery in downtown Atlanta, running my manicured fingers across a massive, pristine slab of Italian Calcutta marble. The showroom was completely quiet, except for the soft hum of the expensive air conditioning system overhead. My newest luxury real estate client expected absolute perfection, and as a premium house flipper and developer, I always delivered exactly that. The sales manager smiled politely as he handed me the credit card terminal for the deposit on the custom stone. The total for the materials was $40,000. I swiped my primary business debit card without a second thought. A sharp electronic beep shattered the quiet atmosphere of the sophisticated room. The small digital screen flashed bright red with a single humiliating word: declined. The sales manager looked away quickly, pretending to check his computer monitor to save me from the immediate embarrassment. My phone vibrated heavily in my purse. I pulled it out and saw a new text message from my husband Jamal. The message was dripping with his usual unearned arrogance and absolute entitlement. I locked your account and transferred the funds out for a critical business investment. Do not plan on coming to the lake house this summer. My mother is using it to host our real family reunion. You need to learn how to be a submissive wife, and maybe this financial timeout will finally teach you some respect. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone, reading the cruel text message twice, to ensure I was fully comprehending his audacity. Any other woman might have broken down right there in the middle of the high-end showroom. Any other wife might have called her husband crying and begging for an explanation or pleading for access to her own money. But I am not any other woman. I am a Spelman College graduate, a proud member of my sorority, and a woman who built a multi-million-dollar luxury real estate empire from the ground up through sheer willpower and relentless grind. I do not cry over foolish, insecure men. I calculate. I reached into the hidden zippered compartment of my purse and pulled out a solid black corporate card. It was tied to a completely separate stealth holding account that Jamal knew absolutely nothing about. I handed the heavy metal card to the manager. Try this one, I said, my voice perfectly steady and ruthlessly calm. The transaction was approved instantly. I signed the receipt, thanked the manager for his time, and walked out of the showroom into the warm Georgia morning air with my head held high. I climbed into the driver's seat of my luxury SUV and locked the heavy doors. The leather seats felt cool against my skin as I took a deep breath to center my racing thoughts. I connected my phone to the vehicle Bluetooth system and immediately dialed my forensic accountant. Simone and I had been sorority sisters back in college, and she was hands down the most ruthless, brilliant financial mind in all of Atlanta. She answered the phone on the second ring. Simone, I need you to run a full comprehensive audit on the joint operating account I share with Jamal right now, I said as I merged onto the busy highway, heading toward the Buckhead neighborhood. My primary card was just declined for a vendor payment, and he sent me a text claiming he locked the account and moved the funds out for an investment. I heard the rapid, aggressive clicking of a keyboard on the other end of the line as Simone accessed my secure financial portals. The silence stretched for a few agonizing seconds before she let out a sharp, audible gasp. Chloe, this is really bad, she said, her voice dropping to a deeply serious tone. He did not just lock the debit card to teach you a lesson, he drained the entire account. I initiated a commercial wire transfer for exactly $150,000 at 6 in the morning. He forged your digital authorization signature to bypass the security protocol for large transfers. He practically stole it in broad daylight. I gripped the steering wheel tightly as the harsh reality of the situation washed over me on $150,000. That was the operational budget for my next 3 luxury development projects. Jamal had always been a walking financial red flag, but this was a massive, unbelievable escalation. To the outside world, Jamal played the perfect traditional role. He was a branch manager at a local bank in the suburbs. He wore expensive tailored suits and he carried himself like a king whenever we attended Sunday service at our megachurch. He loved standing at the pulpit talking about how he was the ultimate provider and the undisputed head of our household. His mother Beatrice constantly praised him in front of the entire congregation, boasting loudly about her successful son, who took such good care of his lucky wife. But behind closed doors, the truth was entirely different and deeply pathetic. I was the actual breadwinner of the family. My luxury interior design and real estate development business brought in 7 figures a year consistently. Jamal used his modest bank salary to buy flashy accessories and lease expensive cars to impress his friends, while I silently paid the mortgage, the utilities, and funded our entire elevated lifestyle. His mother, Beatrice, hated me because I refused to play the quiet, obedient, traditional wife she wanted for her golden child. Beatrice was a toxic, manipulative woman who used religion as a weapon to control everyone around her. She constantly belittled my career and told Jamal he needed to put me in my proper place. It seemed Jamal had finally listened to his bitter mother. "Where did the money go, Simone?" I asked, keeping my emotions completely locked down behind a wall of pure strategy. I need to know exactly where he wired my money. Simone typed furiously for another minute, running traces through the banking network. "The wire went to an offshore business account registered to a cryptocurrency startup," she explained. "Chloe, I am looking at the corporate registration details right now. The startup belongs to Preston." I let out a harsh, bitter laugh that echoed loudly inside the quiet cabin of my car. Preston was Jamal's white brother-in-law, married to Jamal's entitled and incredibly lazy younger sister, Maya. Preston was a classic trust fund kid who spoke to everyone with an air of absolute superiority. He constantly used big legal words, incorrectly trying to sound intimidating, and he loved lecturing me about business, despite the fact that every single one of his tech startups had failed miserably. Jamal worshipped Preston because Preston came from a wealthy white family in the suburbs. Jamal was always desperately trying to buy Preston's approval and respect. And now Jamal had stolen my hard-earned money, committing a federal crime to bail out Preston's latest failing venture. "They think they have me backed into a corner," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, focused whisper. "Jamal thinks because we are legally married he has the right to just take my money and claim my hard-earned assets as his own. He actually told me not to come to the lake house because Beatrice wants to host a huge family reunion there to show off to Preston's wealthy parents." Simone sighed over the phone, clearly frustrated by his audacity. "Chloe, you need to call your divorce lawyer immediately. He is going to try to claim half of everything you own, including that massive mansion on Lake Oconee. He thinks the Georgia marital property laws will protect his theft. He is incredibly stupid," I replied, a cold, predatory smile slowly forming on my face. "Simone, do you remember how I bought the raw land for that lake house 5 years ago before Jamal and I even got engaged?" "Yes, you used a blind limited liability company," Simone said, her tone catching on to my line of thinking. "Oconee Oasis LLC. You are the sole registered agent and the only managing member." "Exactly," I said smoothly. "I bought the raw land through the LLC. I funded the entire construction of that $3 million luxury estate through the LLC using my own private capital. Jamal's name is nowhere on the deed. His name is nowhere on the construction loans. He has never paid a single property tax bill or a single utility bill for that massive house. Legally speaking, Jamal is nothing more than a temporary guest who occasionally sleeps there. It is not marital property. It is a corporate asset belonging entirely to my development business." "What are you going to do, Chloe?" Simone asked, her voice filled with dark anticipation. "I am going to let him have his little family reunion," I said, gripping the steering wheel. "But they will not be hosting it in my house. I will call you back, Simone. I have a major real estate deal to close right now." I disconnected the call and pulled my car into a quiet upscale parking lot overlooking the Atlanta skyline. I scrolled through my encrypted business contacts until I found the direct private number for David, the chief executive officer of Aegis Corporate Retreats. Aegis was a massive international conglomerate that specialized in providing ultra-secure private vacation homes for high-level government contractors and reclusive billionaires. They were famous for their ruthless military-grade security protocols. They employed heavily armed off-duty tactical officers to guard their properties, ensuring absolute uncompromised privacy for their elite clients. David had been trying aggressively to buy my Lake Oconee property for 2 solid years. The house was a modern architectural masterpiece featuring 3 stories of custom floor-to-ceiling glass walls, an infinity pool overlooking the deep water, and a massive private dock. It was exactly the kind of secluded luxury property his high-paying corporate clients demanded. I had always refused to sell because I loved spending my quiet summers there. But things had officially changed and sentimentality was a luxury I could no longer afford. David answered the private line with his usual brisk professional tone. "Chloe, it is a genuine pleasure to hear from you. Please tell me you are finally ready to let me buy that gorgeous lake house of yours." "Good morning, David," leaning back in my comfortable leather seat. "I am ready to sell it today." The property was recently appraised at $3.5 million by an independent firm. "I will sell it to Aegis Retreats today for a flat $3 million in cash." There was a stunned, heavy silence on the other end of the line. David was a seasoned, ruthless negotiator, but even he was shocked by a $500,000 discount on a prime piece of luxury real estate. "That is an incredibly generous offer, Chloe," he finally managed to say. "What exactly is the catch?" "There are 2 strict conditions," I explained, my voice completely devoid of any emotion or hesitation. "First, we bypass the usual drawn-out 60-day escrow process entirely. My legal team will facilitate an expedited commercial transfer. I want the cash wired into my secure holding account by the end of the week. Second, and this is absolutely non-negotiable, Aegis Retreats must take full legal and physical possession of the property on the morning of May 31st. May 31st. David repeated audibly, checking his digital calendar. "That is exactly 10 days from now. We can absolutely accommodate that rapid timeline. We actually have a major international client looking for a highly secure location for the first week of June anyway. We will send our elite tactical security team to lock down the perimeter and secure the main gates on the morning of the 31st. Is there any specific reason for that exact date?" I smiled, looking out at the glittering city skyline. "Let us just say I am doing some heavy spring cleaning, and I want to ensure the property is completely locked down and protected. I would highly recommend you have your security team on high alert that specific day. You might experience a minor issue with some highly unauthorized individuals attempting to trespass on the property under false pretenses." "Understood," David said, chuckling slightly. "You know our security protocols, Chloe. Nobody gets through our gates without explicit corporate authorization. If anyone attempts to trespass on an Aegis property, our armed guards will detain them, and the local authorities will arrest them immediately. We do not play games with our clients' privacy or safety." "That is exactly why I am selling the house to you, David," I said. "I will have my attorneys send over the digital corporate contracts within the hour. It was a pleasure doing business with you." I ended the call and placed my phone on the passenger seat. Jamal wanted to play aggressive financial games with my life. He wanted to steal my hard-earned money to impress his entitled white brother-in-law. He wanted to give the magnificent house I built to his toxic mother so she could parade around like a queen in front of her church friends. He thought he had broken my spirit. He thought sending a cruel text message at 6 in the morning would force me into silent submission. I was about to learn a very painful permanent lesson about what happens when you try to steal from a smart woman who knows exactly how to use the law to her ultimate advantage. I put the car in drive and pulled back onto the busy road, heading toward my primary residence in Buckhead. I needed to pack a bag and gather my most important financial documents. The war had officially begun, and I was already 10 steps ahead of them. The drive from the high-end marble showroom to my primary residence in Buckhead took exactly 45 minutes. The heavy Atlanta traffic gave me plenty of time to compartmentalize my emotions and strategize my next move. I navigated my luxury vehicle through the winding tree-lined streets of my exclusive neighborhood. The massive oak trees formed a lush green canopy overhead, casting shifting shadows across the meticulously manicured lawns of the multi-million-dollar estates. My house sat at the end of a private cul-de-sac, safely secured behind a heavy wrought iron gate. I pulled up to the keypad and punched in my private entry code. The heavy metal gate swung open slowly, revealing the stunning brick facade of the home my late grandfather had worked his entire life to secure for our family. I parked my vehicle inside the spacious garage and took a deep, steadying breath before stepping out into the cool, dim space. I walked through the custom mudroom and set my keys on the entryway table. The house was supposed to be completely empty. Jamal was currently at his bank branch pretending to be a successful financial manager, and we had no domestic staff scheduled for today. But as I stood in this grand foyer, taking off my designer shoes, I heard muffled voices drifting down from the second floor. The voices were loud, grating, and undeniably familiar. It was my mother-in-law, Beatrice, and my incredibly entitled sister-in-law, Maya. I did not call out to them. I simply left my shoes by the door and walked silently up the grand, floating staircase. The thick plush carpeting muffled my footsteps completely. As I approached the heavy double doors of the master suite, the voices became distinctly clear. I paused in the hallway and listened to the absolute audacity unfolding inside my personal sanctuary. Beatrice was loudly lecturing Maya about the biblical duties of a submissive wife. She told Maya that Jamal was finally stepping up to take his rightful place as the absolute authority figure in our marriage. She said Jamal had completely locked my bank accounts to teach me a harsh lesson about financial obedience. I stood there listening to this toxic woman praise her son for committing federal wire fraud. Maya laughed her annoying high-pitched giggle and agreed with her mother. Maya complained that I was always too arrogant and too independent for my own good. She said I needed to be knocked off my high horse, so I would finally understand that Jamal was the true king of our household. I pushed the heavy bedroom door open and stepped inside. The scene before me was enough to make any normal person fly into a violent, screaming rage. But I just stood there perfectly still, observing the pathetic reality of my husband's family. Beatrice and Maya had pulled dozens of black heavy-duty trash bags into my pristine master bedroom. They were aggressively yanking my expensive tailored suits, my custom dresses, and my designer handbags out of my carefully organized closet and shoving them into the garbage bags like common trash. Beatrice was holding a glass of my most expensive imported red wine, spilling small dark drops onto my beautiful cream-colored rug. Maya was standing in front of my vanity mirror, trying on my personal jewelry. She picked up the custom diamond and gold watch I had purchased for myself after closing my first major commercial real estate deal. She fastened it around her wrist and smiled greedily at her reflection. I cleared my throat softly. Both women jumped in absolute shock, spinning around to face me. Maya immediately dropped her hands to her sides, trying to hide the expensive watch behind her back. Beatrice almost dropped her wine glass, but quickly recovered her composure, pulling her face into a smug, arrogant sneer. Beatrice looked me up and down and told me that Jamal had called them this morning. She said Jamal had instructed them to come over and pack up my belongings because I was being evicted from my own marriage. She proudly announced that Jamal was taking back his manhood and his financial control. She said he had decided to move Maya and her white husband Preston into my house by the end of the week so they could save money on rent. Beatrice took a slow sip of my wine and told me I had brought this humiliation upon myself by refusing to submit to my husband's authority. She said the Lord rewards a humble woman and punishes the arrogant. Maya stepped forward, gaining false confidence from her mother. Maya told me that Jamal had promised her the diamond watch for her upcoming wedding anniversary. She said since I was no longer going to be part of the family, I did not need such expensive, flashy things anymore. She told me to grab my trash bags and leave the property before Jamal came home and forced me out himself. They expected me to cry. They wanted me to scream and beg and lose my mind. They were desperate for a dramatic emotional reaction so they could call Jamal and tell him how crazy and unstable I was acting. But I gave them absolutely nothing. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I simply reached into my handbag and pulled out my smart tablet. I tapped the screen and opened the central home automation application. I casually deactivated the smart locks on all the exterior doors, ensuring they could not be secured from the inside. Then I accessed the climate control system. I turned off the central air conditioning for the entire second floor, letting the heavy, humid Georgia heat begin to seep into the room. I looked up from my tablet and met Beatrice directly in the eye. I told Beatrice she had exactly 5 minutes to finish her wine and get off my property. Beatrice laughed loudly, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. She told me I had no right to kick her out of her son house. She said Jamal paid the bills and Jamal made the rules. She said the law would protect her son because he was the head of the household and this was marital property. I smiled a cold, empty smile that made the laughter die in her throat. I told Beatrice she was incredibly ignorant about how real wealth actually works. I explained that Jamal had never paid a single dime toward the mortgage of this multi-million-dollar estate. I told her Jamal had never even seen the deed to this house. I took a slow, deliberate step into the room and explained the actual legal reality of their situation. I told them this house and the land it sits on belongs entirely to a private family trust. My late grandfather established that trust 30 years ago to ensure his descendants would always have a secure home. I am the sole beneficiary and the sole executor of that trust. I explained that Jamal was nothing more than a permitted guest who had been living rent-free on my grandfather's property for the last 4 years. Jamal liked to brag to his church friends that he bought this house to make himself feel important, but it was just another pathetic lie to stroke his fragile ego. Maya took a step backward, looking nervously at her mother. Beatrice's face turned a sickly pale color, but she tried to maintain her arrogant posture. She stammered and said I was lying. She said Jamal was a successful bank manager and he provided for our family. I laughed softly at her absolute delusion. I told Beatrice her son was a drowning man who had just committed a federal crime to bail out Preston's failing cryptocurrency business. I told her Jamal was completely broke and currently under investigation. I watched the fake pious confidence completely drain from Beatrice's face as the truth finally began to sink into her mind. I did not wait for her to formulate another excuse. I pressed the silent panic button programmed into my smartphone. Because this property was owned by a high-net-worth family trust, it was protected by an elite private security firm that operated exclusively in the Buckhead area. Their response time was guaranteed to be under 3 minutes. I stood in the doorway, blocking their exit, and told Maya to take off my diamond watch immediately. She hesitated, her hands trembling as she fumbled with the complex gold clasp. I told her if she damaged the watch, I would have her arrested for grand larceny before the sun went down. She managed to undo the clasp and placed the heavy watch carefully on my vanity table. The heavy sound of tactical boots echoed up the grand staircase. 2 massive private security guards dressed in immaculate black uniforms stepped into the hallway behind me. They were armed and their expressions were completely unreadable and strictly professional. They looked at me awaiting my direct instructions. I pointed at Beatrice and Maya, who were now huddled together in the center of my bedroom, looking absolutely terrified. I told the guards that these 2 individuals were trespassing on private property and attempting to steal my personal belongings. I instructed the guards to escort them off the premises immediately and to ensure they did not take a single item with them. Beatrice began to cry, real tears now, pleading and saying this was a massive misunderstanding. She said we were family and we needed to pray about this together. She tried to use her sweet church lady voice to charm the security guards, but they did not even blink. One guard stepped forward and calmly instructed Beatrice to place the wine glass on the table and walk toward the door. The other guard informed Maya that if she did not comply immediately, local law enforcement would be dispatched to facilitate an arrest for burglary and trespassing. They scrambled toward the door, leaving their black trash bags scattered across my beautiful bedroom floor. I stepped aside to let them pass. As Beatrice walked by me, she glared with pure hatred and told me Jamal would never forgive me for disrespecting his mother this way. She promised that Jamal and Preston would return and use the law to strip me of everything I owned. I simply looked at her and said I was eagerly looking forward to seeing them try. I told Beatrice to enjoy her ride back to the suburbs and reminded her that she was permanently banned from the Lake Oconee property as well. I watched as the guards escorted them down the grand staircase and out the front door, ensuring they walked all the way down the long driveway and off my grandfather's property. Once the house was empty, I walked over to the vanity and picked up my diamond watch, fastening it securely back onto my wrist. I looked at the mess they had made of my designer clothes, but I felt absolutely no distress. They thought they could break into my home, violate my sanctuary, and steal my peace of mind. They thought their toxic family loyalty would somehow overpower my legal ownership and my financial dominance. I picked up my tablet again and permanently revoked Jamal access codes to the main gate, the garage, and the front door. He had wanted to play the role of the supreme provider and the ruthless head of the household. Now he was going to come home to find himself completely locked out of the very castle he claimed to rule. The first battle was won, but I knew the war was far from over. Preston would undoubtedly try to intervene with his unearned white privilege and his fake legal knowledge. Jamal would definitely try to escalate the situation using physical intimidation and emotional manipulation. But I was ready. I had the truth, I had the money, and I had the absolute power of the law on my side. I walked over to the window and looked out at the peaceful tree-lined street, waiting for the next wave of their foolishness to crash against the unbreakable fortress I had built. They had severely underestimated the woman they were dealing with, and before this was over, they would all pay the ultimate price for their greed and their absolute betrayal. I stood by the tall arched window in my master bedroom, watching the heavy wrought iron gates of my grandfather's estate slowly close behind my departing mother-in-law and sister-in-law. Beatrice and Maya were dragging their black trash bags down the long driveway, their faces twisted in bitter humiliation. Before the heavy metal gates could completely shut, a bright silver sports car came speeding around the corner of the cul-de-sac. The tires screeched loudly against the pristine pavement as the driver slammed on the brakes. I recognized the vehicle immediately. It was a leased luxury car driven by Maya's husband Preston. Preston was a man who moved through the world with an unearned sense of absolute authority, simply because he was born into a wealthy white family in the northern suburbs of Atlanta. He had never actually built a successful business or earned a legitimate dollar in his entire life, but he carried himself like a titan of industry. He parked his car, aggressively blocking the entrance to my property, and jumped out, leaving the door wide open. I watched from the second-floor window as he marched past Beatrice and Maya, completely ignoring their tears and complaints. Preston believed he was the ultimate savior of this family, and he was coming to put me in my place. He pushed his way past the private security guards who were standing at the edge of the driveway. The guards looked up at my window for instructions, and I gave them a subtle nod to let him pass. I wanted Preston to walk into my house. I wanted him to feel powerful and confident before I completely destroyed his fragile ego. I turned away from the window and walked back toward the center of my master's suite, smoothing the fabric of my designer skirt. Heavy footsteps echoed up the grand floating staircase. Preston did not bother to knock. He shoved the heavy double doors of my bedroom wide open and stormed inside, his face red with anger and unearned superiority. He stopped a few feet away from me, trying to use his height to physically intimidate me. He wore a ridiculously expensive linen suit that was paid for by his parent trust fund, and he pointed his finger directly at my face. He told me that I had made a massive mistake by kicking his family out of the house. He said he had already spoken to his personal lawyers, and he was here to inform me about the legal reality of my situation. I crossed my arms over my chest and stared at him with an expression of pure, absolute boredom. I let the silence stretch for several long seconds, making him feel awkward and small in my massive bedroom. Finally, I told him to go ahead and share his brilliant legal knowledge with me. Preston puffed out his chest and began spouting convoluted legal terms he clearly did not understand. He confidently declared that Georgia is a state that recognizes marital property. He said that even though the house belonged to my grandfather, Trust Jamal had been paying the utility bills and maintenance costs for the past 4 years. Preston proudly announced that because Jamal used his income to maintain the house, the asset had become commingled under state law. He said Jamal had a legal right to occupy the property and a legal right to move his mother and sister into the house to save money. Preston smirked and told me that his high-priced attorneys would strip me bare in divorce court if I tried to fight them. He told me I needed to learn my place and stop acting like a boss when I was nothing more than an arrogant woman who got lucky with some family money. He said Jamal was the head of the household, and Jamal was finally taking back his power. Preston leaned in closer, trying to invade my personal space. He told me to pack my bags and leave the house before Jamal arrived and forced me out himself. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I just looked at this pathetic man who relied on his race and his family money to feel important. I let out a soft, chilling laugh that echoed off the high ceilings of my bedroom. Preston frowned, clearly confused by my reaction. He had expected me to cower or panic under the weight of his legal threats. Instead, I walked calmly over to my massive custom oak desk, sitting in the corner of the room. I opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a thick, heavy file folder. I turned around and walked back to Preston, slapping the heavy folder directly onto his chest. He stumbled backward slightly, fumbling to catch the documents before they fell to the floor. I told him to open the file and look at the paperwork inside. Preston opened the folder, his eyes scanning the documents with growing confusion. I explained that those were the utility bills, property tax records, and maintenance invoices for the Buckhead estate, covering the entire 4 years Jamal and I had been married. I told Preston to look very closely at the payment source listed on every single line item. I watched as his arrogant smirk slowly began to fade. I explained that every single bill, every tax payment, and every maintenance cost for this house had been paid directly from my private commercial real estate limited liability company. I told him Jamal had never contributed a single penny to the upkeep of this property. Jamal bank accounts had never once been connected to any utility provider for this address. I explained that there was absolutely zero commingling of assets because Jamal was too busy spending his modest bank salary on flashy leased cars and expensive suits to impress people like Preston. I told Preston his entire legal argument was completely invalid and his supposed high-priced attorneys would laugh him out of their office if he brought them this case. I watched the color drain from Preston's face as he realized his grand legal strategy was built on the pathetic lies Jamal had told him. Jamal had always bragged to Preston about being the sole provider of our family to earn Preston respect. Now Preston was holding the undeniable proof that Jamal was nothing more than a financial parasite living off my success. Preston closed the folder, his hands shaking slightly. He tried to recover his arrogant posture, but his voice lacked its previous authority. He stammered that it did not matter who paid the light bill. He said Jamal was still my husband, and Jamal had the legal right to control our joint finances. He reminded me that Jamal had locked my bank accounts this morning and legally transferred $150,000 to secure a business investment for the family. Preston smiled again, thinking he still had the upper hand. He said I was completely broke now, and I had no resources to fight them in court. He told me the money was gone, and Jamal was going to use it to build a real empire. I took a slow, deliberate step toward Preston, completely invading his personal space this time. The air in the room felt heavy and cold as I looked directly into his pale, terrified eyes. I told Preston he was incredibly stupid to think a woman like me would only have one bank account. I explained that the joint account Jamal drained was nothing more than a petty cash fund I used for minor daily expenses. I told him my real wealth was locked away in corporate trusts and offshore holding companies that Jamal could not even begin to comprehend. Preston swallowed hard, his Adam apple bobbing nervously. But that was not the part that should terrify him. I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was the printed confirmation of the wire transfer my forensic accountant Simone had tracked down just an hour ago. I held the paper up so it was inches from Preston's face. I told him to read the routing numbers and the destination account information. I watched as Preston's eyes darted across the page. His breathing suddenly became shallow and rapid. I explained that Jamal had forged my digital authorization signature to initiate that massive commercial wire transfer at 6 in the morning. I told Preston that Jamal had committed a severe federal crime to steal my money. And the most interesting part of this entire situation was where that stolen money ended up. I told Preston he should worry significantly less about my grandfather's house and start worrying deeply about his own freedom. I explained that the $150,000 Jamal stole from me was wired directly into the offshore account of Preston failing cryptocurrency startup. I watched Preston physically stumble backward, dropping the folder of utility bills onto the floor. His entire body began to tremble. I kept my voice perfectly level and ruthlessly calm. I told Preston that his tech company had been bleeding money for months, and he had begged Jamal for a bailout to save face with his wealthy parents. I said Jamal committed federal wire fraud to save Preston failing business, and now Preston was legally a co-conspirator in a massive financial crime. I told him the Federal Bureau of Investigation absolutely loves a good paper trail, especially when it involves offshore cryptocurrency accounts and forged digital signatures. I explained that receiving stolen funds across state and international lines carries a mandatory minimum federal prison sentence. Preston opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The arrogant, entitled white knight who had stormed into my house to teach me a lesson was now gasping for air like a fish out of water. He realized instantly that Jamal had dragged him into a federal crime that would destroy his life, his reputation, and his family wealth. I leaned in closer, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. I told Preston he had exactly two choices. He could walk out of my house right now, drive his leased luxury car back to the suburbs, and hire the best federal defense attorney his parents' money could buy, or he could stay here and wait for the authorities to arrive. I told him my lawyers were currently drafting the formal reports for the Financial Crimes Division, and his name was right at the top of the suspect list. Preston did not say a single word. He turned around and practically ran out of my bedroom, leaving the heavy doors wide open. I listened to his frantic footsteps echoing down the grand staircase and the loud slam of my front door. A few seconds later, the screeching tires of his sports car signaled his desperate escape from my property. I stood in the middle of my quiet master bedroom, feeling a deep, profound sense of satisfaction. I had completely dismantled their arrogant plans and turned their own greed into a weapon that would destroy them and also their fake empire. But my moment of peace was abruptly interrupted by the loud, aggressive sound of another vehicle pulling aggressively into my long, circular driveway. I walked slowly over to the tall, arched window and looked down at the grand entrance of my beautiful estate. Jamal had finally arrived. He slammed the heavy door of his luxury sedan and began marching up the wide stone front steps, with his fists tightly clenched and his face twisted in a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He had obviously received frantic, panicked phone calls from his terrified mother and from a deeply traumatized Preston. The ultimate fake provider had returned home to confront me regarding the absolute chaos I had just unleashed upon his fragile reality, and I was more than ready to break him completely. I heard the heavy front door slam shut with a violent force that shook the walls of the grand foyer. The loud, aggressive sound echoed all the way up the floating staircase and into my master bedroom. Heavy, rapid footsteps began pounding against the hardwood floors. Jamal was running up the stairs. He was breathing heavily and shouting my name with a deep, guttural rage. I stood perfectly still in the center of the room. I did not move toward the door. I simply waited for the storm to enter my sanctuary. Jamal burst through the heavy double doors, shoving them open so hard they slammed against the drywall. His face was flushed a dark, angry red. The veins in his neck were visibly bulging against the collar of his expensive tailored suit. He looked absolutely frantic and completely unhinged. He stopped a few feet away from me. He puffed out his chest, trying to use his physical size to tower over me and intimidate me into submission. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. He demanded to know what kind of insane stunt I was pulling. He said his mother was crying uncontrollably in the driveway of her suburban home. He said Preston had just called him, sounding completely traumatized and terrified about federal investigations. Jamal stepped closer, invading my personal space. He tried to force me to back down. He told me I had lost my mind and crossed a line I could never uncross. He continued his aggressive verbal assault without pausing for a single breath. He paced back and forth across the hardwood floor, gesturing wildly with his hands as he continued to build his magnificent web of lies. Jamal completely flipped the narrative, twisting reality to make himself the ultimate victim. He called me a bitter, disrespectful woman who was actively trying to tear his beautiful family apart out of pure jealousy. He said a real traditional wife would support her husband's financial decisions without questioning his authority. He told me I was lucky he was even willing to stay married to a woman who lacked proper submissive qualities. He proudly puffed out his chest again and declared that he was the undisputed head of our household. He said the $150,000 he stole from my account was not theft. He claimed it was a necessary strategic investment for the future of our family. He said Preston needed the capital to save his business, and Jamal was simply acting as a powerful provider by bailing out his brother-in-law. He told me I was too selfish and too focused on my own career to understand how real generational wealth was built. He said my luxury interior design business was just a lucky hobby, and I needed to learn how to respect his financial genius. Then Jamal delivered his grand master plan with a smug, arrogant smile spreading across his face. He told me he was taking absolute control of our lives starting today. He announced that he had officially invited his entire church congregation to the lake house for the last weekend of May. He said the pastor, the deacons, and all the elders would be there to witness his success. He said his mother Beatrice had invited all her judgmental church friends to celebrate their family legacy. I even bragged that Preston had invited his extremely wealthy white parents from the northern suburbs to attend the massive event. Jamal said this family reunion was going to prove to everyone in Atlanta that he was a highly successful, wealthy man who provided a multi-million-dollar vacation estate for his loved ones. He looked down at me with pure contempt and told me I was explicitly banned from attending the party. He said my negative energy and my bitter attitude would completely ruin his special day. He told me to stay in the city and reflect on my failures as a supportive wife, while his real family enjoyed the incredible luxury of the lake house. I stood there listening to his absolute delusional rant. I watched the spit fly from his mouth as he desperately tried to convince himself that he was a powerful king. I realized in that exact moment that fighting a narcissist with pure logic was a complete waste of my valuable time. Jamal did not care about the truth. He only cared about his fake public image and his fragile male ego. I decided to change my entire strategy right then and there. I needed him to feel comfortable and victorious, so he would blindly walk right into the massive legal trap I had set for him. I decided to play the long game. I let out a soft, trembling breath and allowed my shoulders to drop in a posture of complete defeat. I forced my breathing to become shallow and uneven, as if I was struggling to hold back a total emotional breakdown. I blinked my eyes rapidly, forcing hot tears to well up and slowly spill over my cheeks. I looked down at the floor, acting as though his cruel words had finally shattered my strong exterior. I wrapped my arms around myself and took a shaky step backward. I looked up at Jamal with wide, tear-filled eyes. I let my voice tremble with fake sorrow. I told him he had finally won the war. I said I was completely exhausted and I simply could not fight him anymore. I told him he was right about everything. I said, "Fine, Jamal, you can take the money, and you can take the lake house for your grand party." I told him I would stop fighting for my place in this marriage. I said I would pack a single suitcase right now and leave him in peace so he could enjoy his family without my toxic presence ruining his life. I wiped a fake tear from my chin and sniffled quietly. I turned away from him and walked slowly toward my massive walk-in closet, moving with the heavy, sluggish steps of a truly broken woman. I watched Jamal out of the corner of my eye. His entire demeanor shifted instantly. The red-hot anger drained from his face and was quickly replaced by an expression of pure, supreme satisfaction. He actually believed his aggressive shouting and his ridiculous demands had successfully forced me into submission. He smirked, crossing his arms over his chest like a triumphant conqueror. He genuinely thought he had broken my spirit and put me back in my proper place. He watched me with absolute arrogance as I pulled a small leather overnight bag from the top shelf of my closet. I kept my head down, hiding the cold, calculating expression that threatened to break through my performance. I slowly packed a few basic items of clothing and my essential toiletries. I made sure to sniffle loudly a few more times to really sell the illusion of my total defeat. Jamal stood in the doorway of the closet, blocking my path with his body. He delivered one final arrogant lecture as I zipped my small bag closed. He told me this separation would be good for my soul. He said I needed to spend the next few weeks alone in a cheap hotel room, reflecting on my massive failures as a loving wife. He told me, maybe when the Grand Lake House party was over, he would consider letting me come back home if I showed true genuine remorse and promised to submit to his financial authority. I did not say a single word in response. I simply nodded my head, keeping my eyes fixed on the floor. I squeezed past him, clutching my bag tightly to my chest. I walked out of the master bedroom and began my slow descent down the grand floating staircase. I could feel his smug, victorious gaze burning into my back with every step I took. I walked through the foyer and pushed the heavy front door open, stepping out into the warm, humid Georgia afternoon. I walked down the stone steps and placed my small leather bag into the passenger seat of my luxury vehicle. I climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. I did not look back at the house. I put the car in drive and pulled slowly down the long, winding driveway. I navigated past the heavy wrought iron gates of my grandfather's estate, watching them close securely behind my vehicle in the rearview mirror. I turned the steering wheel and merged onto the quiet tree-lined street, leaving my toxic, manipulative husband standing in a house he did not own, celebrating a victory he had not actually won. As soon as my vehicle turned the corner and the estate was completely out of sight, my entire performance came to an abrupt, sudden halt. I reached up and wiped the fake tears from my cheeks with the back of my hand. My posture immediately straightened, and the trembling in my hands vanished completely. My face settled into a cold, ruthless expression of pure, absolute determination. The pathetic charade was finally over. Jamal had swallowed the bait whole without a single second of hesitation. I was going to spend the next 10 days bragging to his entire church congregation and his entitled white in-laws about a luxury estate he no longer had any legal right to enter. He was digging his own social and financial grave with his bare hands, and I was more than happy to hand him the shovel. I pulled my car onto the highway, heading toward the exclusive high-rise district downtown, where I had already booked a luxury penthouse suite for the next few weeks. I watched the city skyline grow larger in the distance, feeling a massive weight lifting off my shoulders. My phone suddenly rang, breaking the quiet silence inside the cabin of my car. The caller identification displayed on the dashboard screen showed the name David. He was the chief executive officer of the elite corporate security firm that had been aggressively trying to buy my lake property for 2 years. I tapped the screen to answer the call, keeping my eyes focused on the road ahead. David's voice came through the speakers, sounding brisk, professional, and highly efficient. "The transfer is complete," Chloe David announced with a tone of absolute certainty. He said his financial team had finalized the expedited escrow process, and the $3 million in cash had already been wired directly into my secure private holding account. He confirmed that Aegis Corporate Retreats now legally owned the massive lakefront estate in its entirety. He said his elite tactical security teams were currently reviewing the property blueprints and preparing their deployment strategy. He assured me they would be ready to take full physical possession of the grounds and lock down the perimeter at the exact time we had agreed upon. He said the smart gates would be reprogrammed with new encrypted access codes at midnight on May 30th. David promised that absolutely no one would be allowed onto the corporate premises on May 31st, without explicit executive authorization, and heavily armed guards would be waiting to detain any unauthorized individuals who attempted to breach the main entrance. I smiled a genuine cold smile as I listened to his thorough security update. I thanked David for his rapid, efficient work and told him I deeply appreciated his commitment to protecting his new corporate asset. I ended the call and let the quiet hum of the engine wash over me. The trap was now fully set, and the countdown to absolute destruction had officially begun. Jamal thought he had stolen my money and conquered my spirit. I thought he was the powerful, undisputed king of his fragile little world. He had no idea he was driving his entire family straight into a massive federal and legal nightmare that would completely shatter their pathetic fake empire. I drove toward my luxury downtown hotel suite, feeling nothing but pure, unadulterated peace. The drive into the very heart of downtown Atlanta was smooth and entirely uneventful. I pulled my luxury vehicle into the secure underground parking garage of the Grand Meridian Luxury Hotel. The valet greeted me by name and took my keys while a bellhop discreetly collected my single overnight bag. I walked into the private elevator reserved exclusively for penthouse guests and swiped my elite membership card. The doors closed silently, shutting out the noise of the city below. The elevator shot upward, ascending 40 floors in a matter of mere seconds. When the doors opened, I stepped directly into a massive, sprawling suite that overlooked the entire glittering skyline. The space was immaculate, decorated in deep charcoal and brushed gold with floor-to-ceiling windows that let the afternoon sunlight pour over the expensive hardwood floors. I walked over to the wet bar and poured myself a tall glass of sparkling water. I took a slow, refreshing sip, letting the cool liquid soothe my tired throat. I had booked this exact suite for the next 3 weeks, paying up front with my corporate account. It was the perfect, luxurious fortress where I could orchestrate the absolute destruction of my fake husband. I set my glass down on the marble counter and walked over to the massive mahogany desk sitting in the corner of the room. I opened my sleek leather briefcase and pulled out my primary business laptop. I needed to move quickly and efficiently before Jamal or Preston could attempt any desperate legal maneuvers to hide their severe federal crimes. A soft knock echoed from the heavy mahogany door of my suite. I pressed a button on the wall panel to unlock the door. My personal attorney stepped into the room looking absolutely flawless in a sharp-tailored burgundy suit. Her name was Victoria, and she was one of my oldest, closest friends from our early days at Spelman College. Victoria was a brilliant, ruthless legal mind who specialized in high-asset corporate divorces and severe financial litigation. She was widely known across the state of Georgia as a woman who never ever lost a case. She walked into the suite carrying a heavy leather briefcase of her own and a thick stack of printed financial documents. Victoria locked the door behind her and gave me a fiercely determined smile. She told me she had brought everything we needed today. I pulled out a comfortable leather chair for Victoria, and we immediately sat down at the desk to begin our serious work. Victoria opened her briefcase and began laying out years of hidden financial records that my forensic accountant Simone had managed to extract from the banking network. The paperwork painted a pathetic, embarrassing picture of my husband and his massive, fragile ego. We spent the next 2 hours completely dissecting Jamal and his hidden financial failures. Jamal had been secretly taking out massive, high-interest personal loans for the past 3 full years. He used this borrowed money to fund his fake lavish lifestyle so he could maintain his boss image at our megachurch. He bought expensive custom suits and luxury watches on credit, just so his toxic mother Beatrice could brag about him to the entire congregation. But the most pathetic revelation was how much money he had actively funneled to Preston. Jamal was deeply insecure and absolutely desperate for the approval of his entitled white brother-in-law. The documents proved that Jamal had been quietly paying off Preston failing business debts for months, trying to buy respect from the white side of their extended family. Jamal had literally bankrupted himself trying to impress a trust fund kid who secretly despised him. Victoria pointed to a specific legal document showing the $150,000 wire transfer from this morning. She told me this was the absolute final nail in his coffin. Jamal had crossed the line from being a pathetic financial failure to being an active federal criminal. Victoria explained that she had already drafted the official divorce petition, citing severe financial abuse and absolute irreconcilable differences. She had also prepared a comprehensive reporting packet for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, detailing the exact timeline of the wire fraud. She told me she would file the divorce papers with the state court tomorrow morning, ensuring Jamal would be completely blindsided. I thanked Victoria for her incredible speed and flawless execution. We spent another hour reviewing the specific details of my corporate assets, ensuring that every single property I owned was securely shielded behind impenetrable legal trusts. Jamal was going to walk out of this marriage with absolutely nothing but the massive mountain of debt he had secretly accumulated. Victoria finally packed up her briefcase and told me she would handle the rest alone. After Victoria left the luxury penthouse suite, I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out at the busy city below. The afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden glow across the towering glass buildings of Atlanta. My phone chimed softly on the desk, interrupting my quiet, peaceful thoughts. It was a calendar notification reminding me about my highly anticipated meeting with the Chief Executive Officer of Aegis Corporate Retreats. David was scheduled to arrive at my suite at exactly 5 o'clock in the evening to finalize the massive real estate transaction. I walked into the luxurious bathroom and quickly touched up my makeup, ensuring I looked sharp, professional, and entirely unbothered. I smoothed the wrinkles from my tailored designer suit and walked back into the main living area, just as a firm, sharp knock echoed from the heavy front door. I opened the door and greeted David with a warm, professional smile. David was a tall, imposing man who moved with the quiet, lethal efficiency of a former military officer. He stepped into my suite carrying a sleek titanium briefcase and thanked me profusely for agreeing to meet today on short notice. I invited David to sit at the large mahogany dining table in the center of the suite. He opened his titanium briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of highly secure corporate contracts. David explained that his legal team had already verified the clean title and the clear corporate ownership of the Lake Oconee estate. He praised my meticulous record-keeping and said it was a rare pleasure to deal with a real estate developer who understood the value of absolute corporate privacy. I sat across from him and pulled out my smart tablet. We spent the next 30 minutes signing the digital contracts, transferring the full legal deed of the property from my holding company directly to Aegis Corporate Retreats. Once the final digital signature was verified, David pressed a button on his phone and confirmed that the $3 million in cash had been permanently secured in my private accounts. The massive luxury estate no longer belonged to me. It was now the exclusive private property of a ruthless corporate conglomerate. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small encrypted flash drive containing the digital master keys, the smart access codes, and the advanced security blueprints. I handed the secure flash drive across the table directly to David. I explained that the drive contained everything his elite tactical security team would need to take absolute physical control of the property. I told him the current entry codes would remain active until midnight on May 30th. At exactly 1 minute past midnight, I instructed him to have his team purge the system and activate their own encrypted military-grade access protocols. I told him he needed to lock down the entire perimeter block, the main driveway, and secure the private dock leading out to the deep water of the lake. David nodded his head, accepting the flash drive and placing it carefully into his secure titanium briefcase. He told me Aegis Retreats was famous for hosting high-level government contractors, foreign diplomats, and reclusive billionaires who demanded total absolute isolation. He said his company employed a massive roster of off-duty SWAT officers and highly trained tactical guards to ensure their properties remained completely impenetrable. He promised me that once his security team took over the lake house, absolutely no one would be allowed to set foot on the beautiful manicured grounds without his explicit corporate authorization. I listened to David explain his strict security measures, feeling a deep, profound sense of satisfaction spreading warmly through my chest. Jamal and his toxic, entitled family were completely oblivious to the massive corporate trap I had just legally finalized. They were currently spending their time bragging to their church congregation and printing out lavish invitations for a spectacular family reunion at a property they had absolutely zero right to enter. They were preparing to parade Preston and his wealthy white parents right up to the front gates of a corporate fortress, guarded by men who carried tactical rifles and answered to no one but David. I smiled a calm, pleasant smile and offered David a glass of premium-aged whiskey from the wet bar to celebrate our highly successful rapid transaction. He accepted the drink and we toasted to a flawless, profitable business deal. David took a slow sip of the rich amber liquid and looked at me with a sharp, curious expression in his dark eyes. He leaned forward, resting his strong forearms on the mahogany table. He asked me a very direct question, based on the unusual specific demands I had placed on this rapid cash sale. Chloe, David began, his voice low and very serious. You insisted that my team take full physical possession of the property on the exact morning of May 31st. You also warned me earlier today that we might experience a minor issue with some unauthorized individuals attempting to access the estate under false pretenses. Given the rapid nature of this sale and the extreme precision of your timeline, I have to ask you a professional question. Do you expect any serious unwanted visitors to show up at the gates during the actual handover process? Should my team be prepared for a genuine hostile confrontation on the morning of the 31st? I looked David directly in the eyes, maintaining my perfectly composed professional demeanor. I set my glass of cold, sparkling water down on the table and let a slow, sharp smile spread across my face. I thought about Jamal puffing his chest out and screaming about how he was the supreme ruler of his household. I thought about Beatrice drinking my wine and claiming she was entitled to my hard-earned wealth. I thought about Preston trying to intimidate me with his fake legal threats and his unearned privilege. I looked back at David and gave him the exact warning he needed to hear. I suggest you have the local county sheriff on active standby for the morning of May 31st. David, I said, my voice ruthlessly calm and completely cold. You are going to have a massive, highly aggressive trespassing situation on your hands. There is a deeply delusional man who genuinely believes he owns that property, and he is planning to bring 50 of his closest friends and family members to crash your gates. They will likely be incredibly hostile, and they will absolutely refuse to leave when you deny them entry. I highly recommend your tactical team is fully prepared to make multiple arrests, because they will not go away quietly. David did not look worried or intimidated by my warning. Instead, a slow, confident smile mirrored my own on his face. He finished the last sip of his premium whiskey and stood up from the table, picking up his secure titanium briefcase. He looked down at me and promised that his elite security team would handle the trespassing situation with extreme legal prejudice. He said anyone breaching his gates would face strict handcuffs immediately. The next morning, the digital world woke up to a carefully orchestrated smear campaign. It was exactly the kind of predictable, pathetic behavior I had come to expect from people who possess no real power or intelligence. Jamal and his mother Beatrice had clearly spent the entire night crafting a completely fictional narrative to share across all their social media platforms. I sat at the polished mahogany desk in my downtown penthouse suite, scrolling through my phone while sipping my morning coffee. The absolute audacity of their online performance was almost impressive in its sheer delusion. Beatrice had posted a massive album of photos showing herself and Maya shopping at high-end boutiques in the affluent parts of Atlanta. They were holding dozens of designer shopping bags and smiling brightly for the camera. The caption beneath the photos was a long dramatic essay about how a mother love can heal a broken son. Beatrice wrote that Jamal had finally found the strength to put his foot down against a toxic, financially abusive wife who had been trying to tear their beautiful family apart. She claimed that I was a bitter, deeply insecure woman who could not handle a strong traditional man taking his rightful place as the head of the household. Maya shared the post, immediately adding her own pathetic commentary. She wrote that she was so proud of her big brother for escaping a narcissistic marriage and taking back his financial freedom. It was a perfectly executed strategy, designed to paint me as the villain and position Jamal as the ultimate triumphant survivor. They wanted the world to believe that I was the one who had failed, that I was the one who had ruined our marriage through my independence and my career ambitions. They tagged dozens of extended family members, ensuring that their toxic lies reached every single person we knew in the city. Jamal took his public performance even further. He uploaded a staged video of himself sitting in his modest bank manager office wearing a brand new tailored suit that he had undoubtedly purchased using the money he stole from my account. He looked directly into the camera and delivered a self-righteous speech about the importance of family values and generational wealth. He told his hundreds of followers that he had spent the last 4 years carrying the heavy burden of providing for an ungrateful wife who never respected his authority. He proudly announced that he was celebrating his newfound freedom by hosting a massive 200-person catered event at his multi-million-dollar vacation estate on Lake Oconee. He tagged his entire church congregation, the pastor, the deacons, and all the elder board members, inviting them to witness his grand success. The comments section under his video was flooded with support from church friends who praised him for his strength and his unyielding faith. They called him a true provider and congratulated him on building such an incredible life for his loved ones. The most enraging part of his online spectacle was the formal digital invitation he posted for the family reunion. He had explicitly tagged Preston and his wealthy white parents from the northern suburbs, ensuring everyone knew that the elite side of his extended family would be attending his lavish party. Jamal was parading around his small suburban bank, acting like a corporate titan who had just conquered the world. He was completely blinded by his own arrogance and his desperate need for public validation. He actually believed that his lies would become the truth, simply because he spoke them out loud on the internet. As their social media posts went viral across our shared network, my phone began to ring constantly. Close friends, business associates, and several long-term real estate clients called me in a state of absolute panic. They had seen the terrible rumors and the aggressive accusations Jamal and Beatrice were spreading online. They wanted to know if the stories were true and if I was doing all right after such a public humiliation. Some friends offered their immediate support, while others simply wanted to feed their own curiosity about the sudden dramatic collapse of my marriage. I maintained absolute total radio silence. I did not answer a single phone call. I did not reply to a single text message. I refused to engage in their pathetic public mudslinging contest. I knew that defending myself online would only give them the attention and the drama they were so desperately craving. A smart woman does not argue with fools in a public forum, she simply builds a quiet, flawless case behind the scenes. While Jamal was busy performing for his church friends, and Maya was busy swiping stolen credit cards at designer boutiques, I was working tirelessly with federal authorities. I spent the next 4 days locked inside my luxury penthouse suite, finalizing the official divorce petition with Victoria. We meticulously documented every single financial asset, every corporate trust, and every piece of property I owned, ensuring Jamal would not be able to touch a single dime of my actual wealth. More importantly, I spent hours on secure video calls with federal investigators from the Financial Crimes Division. We handed over the comprehensive audit Simone had prepared, detailing the exact timeline and the digital footprint of the $150,000 wire fraud. The authorities were highly interested in the offshore cryptocurrency accounts associated with Preston and his failing startup. They assured my legal team that a formal investigation had been officially opened and warrants were currently being processed. The trap was growing tighter around them with every passing hour, while they continued to dance blindly toward the edge of a massive legal cliff. The sheer volume of incoming calls forced me to temporarily disable my personal phone line. I instructed my executive assistant to intercept all business inquiries and issue a standard corporate response stating that I was currently unavailable due to private matters, but that my real estate firm was operating at full capacity. I could not allow the toxic noise of Jamal and his mother to interfere with my professional reputation or my ongoing development projects. The people who truly mattered, the people of unwavering support, knowing that I would handle the situation with the ruthless grace they had come to expect from me. The contrast between my silent, dignified preparation and the loud, messy behavior of my husband family was incredibly stark. Beatrice continued to post daily updates about the upcoming party, sharing pictures of floral arrangements and custom-catered menus that she was ordering under Jamal's name. She was spending money like water, completely oblivious to the fact that the well she was drinking from was about to run completely dry and leave her stranded in the desert. Preston even joined the online circus, posting a lengthy, arrogant essay about the importance of protecting family assets from manipulative spouses. He used several incorrect legal terms in his post, trying to sound like a sophisticated investor who was actively advising Jamal on how to secure his wealth. I read his pathetic post and simply smiled, taking a digital screenshot to add to the growing mountain of evidence my legal team was assembling for the federal prosecutors. Preston was digging his own grave and proudly streaming the entire excavation process live on the internet. The sheer level of absolute entitlement radiating from that family was both exhausting and highly motivating. It fueled my focus and kept my mind perfectly sharp during the long, grueling hours of legal preparation. Victoria and I spent countless evenings ordering takeout to the penthouse and reviewing every single line of the divorce petition until the language was absolutely bulletproof. We built a legal fortress around my grandfather's estate in Buckhead, ensuring that Jamal could never again attempt to claim residency or assert any marital rights over the property. We also drafted aggressive civil lawsuits against Beatrice and Maya for their attempted theft and trespassing, hoping to send a clear permanent message that my boundaries were never to be tested again. The amount of meticulous detail required to dismantle a toxic marriage while simultaneously assisting in a federal fraud investigation was staggering, but I refused to let exhaustion slow me down. I was running on pure adrenaline and the cold, comforting promise of absolute justice. The days blurred together in a quiet, focused routine of legal preparation and strategic planning. The calendar finally turned to the night of May 30th. The heavy, humid heat of the impending Georgia summer settled over the city of Atlanta. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse, looking out at the glittering skyline below. It was exactly 10 o'clock in the evening. My phone vibrated softly on the desk behind me. I walked over and picked it up, seeing a new text message from Jamal. He had sent me a picture of the massive wrought iron entrance gates at the Lake Oconee estate. He was standing in front of the stone pillars, holding a heavy crystal glass of expensive whiskey up to the camera. He looked incredibly smug and completely victorious in the dim evening light. His tailored clothes looked completely out of place against the natural landscape of the lake, but he was too obsessed with his image to care. The text message attached to the photo was dripping with his usual unearned arrogance. He wrote, "Thanks for the house, loser. We are setting up the massive party tents on the lawn right now. Do not even try to show up tomorrow because security will drag you away." I stared at the message, feeling a deep, cold wave of satisfaction wash over me. He was currently standing on property that legally belonged to a ruthless international security conglomerate, and he had absolutely no idea. He was celebrating a victory that did not exist in a house he did not own, using money that was about to send him straight to a federal penitentiary. The sheer magnitude of his ignorance was almost poetic. I did not type a long emotional response. I did not warn him about the catastrophic storm that was about to hit his fragile little world. I simply opened my keyboard and replied with a single simple thumbs-up emoji. I placed the phone face down on the mahogany desk and walked into the luxurious master bathroom to prepare for bed. I needed to be perfectly rested and incredibly sharp for the events that would unfold tomorrow morning. The hours ticked by slowly as the city below grew quiet. I lay in the dark suite listening to the distant sounds of traffic and anticipating the dawn. At exactly 11:59 in the evening, the digital smart gate system connected to the lake house underwent a massive corporate system purge. The local area network was severed, and the existing access codes were permanently deleted from the cloud server. Jamal's application, which he had been using to proudly control the front gates, suddenly glitched and refreshed. The bright green authorized status on his phone screen instantly turned a dark violet red. A single error message flashed across the digital interface reading "Access denied." The perimeter of the $3 million estate was now officially locked down under military-grade encryption, and the new corporate owners were actively monitoring the grounds. The beautiful summer night remained perfectly calm and quiet, but the absolute destruction of Jamal and his entire toxic family was now completely inevitable. They had severely underestimated my intelligence and my willingness to fight back with absolute ferocity. They thought my silence over the past few days was a sign of weakness or surrender. They were dead wrong. I closed my eyes and drifted off into a deep, peaceful sleep, knowing tomorrow morning would bring the ultimate public reckoning. Their pathetic reign was officially over forever. The morning of May 31st arrived with a brilliant golden sunrise that stretched across the quiet Atlanta skyline. I woke up in my luxurious downtown penthouse suite, feeling completely refreshed and entirely invigorated. I had slept perfectly soundly through the night, knowing that today was the day my absolute justice would finally be served. I stepped out of the plush hotel bed and walked toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows to watch the city slowly come to life below me. The weather was absolutely flawless without a single dark cloud in the bright blue sky. It was the perfect day for a highly public, spectacular reckoning. I walked into the marble bathroom and took a long hot shower, letting the steam clear away any remaining tension from the past few days. I washed my hair and dried it meticulously, making sure every single strand was perfectly in place. I needed to look absolutely flawless today because I was stepping onto a massive battlefield and my appearance was my first weapon. I walked into the spacious walk-in closet of the penthouse suite to select my armor for the day. I chose a stunning tailored designer suit in a deep striking shade of emerald green. The crisp, structured lines of the blazer made me look incredibly powerful and completely untouchable. I paired the suit with a simple silk blouse and my most expensive designer heels. I applied my makeup with ruthless precision, ensuring my expression looked sharp awake and totally unbothered by the pathetic drama my husband had tried to drag me into. I slipped my diamond watch onto my wrist, the very same watch my entitled sister-in-law, Maya, had tried to steal from my bedroom just a few days ago. I grabbed my leather briefcase containing all the final legal documents and walked out of the suite. I took the private elevator up to the rooftop helipad of the hotel, where my attorney Victoria had already chartered a private luxury helicopter for our journey. Victoria was waiting for me near the aircraft, looking equally fierce in a sharp black suit. The loud, rhythmic chopping sound of the helicopter blades echoed across the rooftop as we approached the waiting aircraft. Victoria handed me a hot cup of premium espresso and gave me a dark, knowing smile. We climbed into the plush leather seats of the helicopter and fastened our heavy safety harnesses. The pilot greeted us professionally and initiated the takeoff sequence, lifting us smoothly off the roof of the Grand Meridian Hotel. We soared high above the morning traffic, leaving the busy streets of Atlanta far behind us. The flight to Lake Oconee would take roughly 45 minutes by air, giving us plenty of time to review our final strategy. Victoria opened her briefcase and pulled out the finalized divorce petition, along with the federal wire fraud reporting documents. She confirmed that the local authorities and the federal investigators were all perfectly aligned and ready to move. We drank our espresso in quiet, comfortable silence, looking down at the lush green Georgia landscape rushing by beneath us. Meanwhile, miles away at the massive Lake Oconee estate, Jamal was experiencing a very different kind of morning. He woke up in the sprawling master bedroom of the $3 million house feeling like an absolute king. He had spent the previous evening bragging to the local neighborhood association and showing off the property to the vendors he had hired for his ridiculous party. He stretched his arms and let out a loud, satisfied yawn, completely oblivious to the massive corporate trap that had snapped shut around him at midnight. He reached for the bedside lamp to turn on the lights, but the switch did nothing. He frowned and clicked the switch a few more times, but the room remained covered in the dim morning shadows. Jamal assumed it was just a minor electrical glitch and grabbed his smartphone from the nightstand to check the main house application. His phone battery was almost completely dead because the charging dock had stopped working during the night. Jamal climbed out of the massive king-sized bed and walked over to the digital climate control panel on the wall. The screen was completely blank and totally unresponsive. He quickly realized that the power to the entire master suite had been deliberately severed. The air conditioning unit was no longer humming, and the heavy, humid air of the lake was already beginning to seep into the room. Jamal let out an angry, frustrated sigh, assuming that the massive party tents set up on the lawn had somehow tripped a major circuit breaker. He put on a lavish silk robe over his pajamas, tying the sash tightly around his waist. He grabbed his dying phone and stomped out of the bedroom, heading toward the main electrical room on the ground floor. He was annoyed that his perfect morning was being interrupted by maintenance issues, but he was still arrogant enough to believe he was in total control of the situation. He walked down the grand staircase, completely unaware of the chaos brewing outside. As Jamal reached the ground floor, his phone began to vibrate violently in his pocket. He looked at the screen and saw an incoming call from the head catering manager he had hired for the massive family reunion. Jamal answered the phone with a brisk, authoritative tone, trying to sound like a busy, wealthy executive. The catering manager sounded incredibly panicked and deeply frustrated. He told Jamal that his entire fleet of food trucks and service vans were currently stuck outside the main community security gate. The manager explained that the community guards were refusing to let them pass, claiming that the access credentials Jamal had provided were completely invalid. Jamal rolled his eyes and let out a loud scoff of pure disbelief. He told the manager to calm down and promised he would clear up the minor misunderstanding immediately. He ended the call and opened his smart home application to manually override the community gate protocols just like he had done yesterday. Jamal confidently tapped the screen of his phone, expecting to see the familiar green interface of the gate control system. Instead, the screen flashed a dark, violent red displaying a massive error message that read, "Access completely denied." Jamal stared at his phone in absolute shock. He tapped the screen again and again, his thumb hitting the glass with increasing frustration and rising panic. The application refused to respond to any of his commands. The entire network connection had been permanently severed. Jamal felt a hot flash of anger rising in his chest. He immediately assumed that I was behind this technical issue. He convinced himself that I was sitting in some cheap hotel room, throwing a petty emotional tantrum and messing with the smart home accounts to ruin his special day. He thought I was just trying to annoy him because I was bitter and jealous of his magnificent family reunion. His massive ego absolutely refused to consider any other logical explanation for the sudden complete lockdown of the estate. Jamal aggressively dialed the direct phone number for the local neighborhood homeowners association. He paced back and forth across the dark foyer of the lake house, waiting for someone to answer the emergency line. When the community manager finally picked up the phone, Jamal immediately launched into a loud, arrogant tirade. He demanded to know why his catering trucks were being blocked at the main entrance. He screamed that he was the owner of the largest estate in the entire community, and he demanded absolute respect from the association staff. The community manager remained perfectly calm and completely unbothered by Jamal's loud, aggressive shouting. The manager politely informed Jamal that the access credentials for that specific property had been officially revoked during the night. The manager explained that the registered legal owner of the estate had completely changed the security protocols and submitted a formal corporate lockdown request. The manager said they were legally obligated to deny entry to anyone who was not explicitly listed on the new corporate security manifest. Jamal's face turned a deep, angry shade of red. He screamed into the phone, claiming that he was the legal owner of the house and his wife was just playing malicious games. He told the manager he would sue the entire neighborhood association if they did not open the gates for his vendors immediately. The manager simply repeated that the property was now registered to a commercial corporate entity, and Jamal's name was nowhere on the updated legal deed. The manager advised Jamal to contact the corporate owner directly to resolve the dispute and then abruptly ended the phone call. Jamal stood in the foyer staring at his dead phone with a look of pure, unhinged rage. His mind was spinning with confusion and blind anger, but his absolute delusion kept him from seeing the massive trap. He still genuinely believed he had the legal upper hand because of Georgia marital property laws. He thought I had simply transferred the deed to a different private company to annoy him. He decided he would just walk down to the main gates himself and physically force the guards to let his people inside. Jamal tightened the sash of his silk robe and marched aggressively out the front door of the massive house. The morning heat was already sweltering, and the humidity clung to his skin, making him sweat almost immediately. He stomped down the long, sweeping stone driveway, heading toward the secondary wrought iron gates that separated the private estate from the rest of the exclusive community. His bare feet slapped loudly against the expensive leather loafers he had hastily shoved on. He was muttering angry curses under his breath, planning exactly how he was going to humiliate the security guards and then call his lawyers to punish me for this ridiculous inconvenience. He looked at the massive white party tents that were partially erected on the pristine green lawn, feeling a surge of arrogant pride. This was his kingdom, and he refused to let anyone disrespect his ultimate authority. He walked faster, determined to save his perfect family reunion from this temporary annoying setback. As Jamal marched down the middle of the long stone driveway, a sudden loud roaring noise shattered the quiet morning peace of the lake. It sounded like multiple heavy-duty engines approaching the property at a highly aggressive speed. Jamal stopped walking and frowned, looking around in confusion. Before he could even process what was happening, the massive wrought iron gates at the end of the driveway suddenly swung wide open. Jamal smirked, thinking the community manager had finally realized his mistake and opened the gates to let the catering trucks inside. But the vehicles that came speeding through the entrance were not catering vans. Three massive matte black tactical sport utility vehicles screeched through the open gates, moving in a tight, flawless military formation. The heavy vehicles tore up the driveway at a terrifying speed, kicking up small clouds of dust and gravel. Jamal stumbled backward, his eyes wide with sudden genuine fear, as the massive black vehicles barreled directly toward him. The three tactical vehicles slammed on their heavy brakes, simultaneously stopping just a few yards away from where Jamal was standing in his silk robe. The loud, violent screech of the tires echoed across the quiet lakefront property, causing a flock of birds to scatter from the nearby trees. The black vehicles formed a solid, impenetrable wall across the stone driveway, completely blocking Jamal's path to the main entrance. The engines idled with a deep, powerful rumbling sound that vibrated through the ground. The windows of the vehicles were tinted completely black, making it impossible for Jamal to see who was sitting inside. His arrogant, smug demeanor vanished, entirely replaced by a look of total absolute shock and rising panic. He took another slow step backward, his bare heels slipping slightly against the back of his expensive leather loafers. He had expected to see a few local security guards bringing him his party supplies, but instead he was facing what looked like a highly coordinated federal tactical raid. The heavy doors of the lead tactical vehicle swung open simultaneously. Four massive, heavily armed men stepped out onto the stone driveway, moving with lethal fluid precision. They wore immaculate black tactical uniforms, with thick, heavy, bulletproof vests strapped securely across their broad chests. They wore dark sunglasses and carried professional-grade communication radios clipped to their shoulders. They did not look like local neighborhood security guards. They looked like a highly trained private military contractor team, executing a hostile corporate takeover. The four men fanned out across the driveway, forming a solid wall of human muscle and tactical gear between Jamal and the front gates. Their expressions were completely cold, unreadable, and totally devoid of any emotion. They did not draw their weapons, but their hands rested casually near the heavy utility belts on their waists, making their absolute physical dominance perfectly clear. Jamal stood frozen in the middle of the driveway, staring at the armed men in sheer, terrified silence. One of the men, who appeared to be the tactical team leader, took a slow, deliberate step forward. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a sharp military haircut and a deeply serious expression. He looked Jamal up and down, taking in the pathetic sight of a man standing in a luxury driveway, wearing nothing but pajamas and a silk robe. The team leader did not smile, and he did not introduce himself. He spoke with a deep, commanding voice that carried perfectly across the warm morning air. He informed Jamal that he was currently trespassing on a highly secure private corporate facility. He told Jamal that his presence on the property was completely unauthorized, and he was in direct violation of state and federal trespassing statutes. The team leader ordered Jamal to turn around, walk back into the house, gather his immediate personal belongings, and vacate the premises within exactly 15 minutes, or he would be physically detained and formally arrested by local law enforcement. Jamal's face flushed with a sudden wave of defensive anger. His fragile male ego simply could not handle being spoken to like a criminal on what he believed was his own property. He puffed out his chest, trying to regain his false sense of authority. He pointed his finger at the tactical team leader and shouted that this was his house. He screamed that he was a successful bank manager and he had legal marital rights to the estate. He told the armed men that they were making a massive mistake and he would have all of them fired and sued for harassment. Jamal yelled that his wife was just playing petty games with the title, and he demanded that they step aside and let his catering trucks onto the lawn. He tried to use his loud, booming church voice to intimidate the highly trained security team, completely oblivious to how utterly pathetic and ridiculous he looked standing there in his slippers and robe, trying to threaten men wearing bulletproof vests. The tactical team leader did not even blink at Jamal's loud, aggressive shouting. He simply reached into the heavy cargo pocket of his uniform pants and pulled out a thick, folded legal document. He unrolled the paper and held it up for Jamal to see. The document was a certified copy of the final commercial property deed, officially recorded and stamped by the state of Georgia. The team leader explained in a slow, cold voice that the property was legally purchased and fully acquired by Aegis Corporate Retreats 10 days ago. He told Jamal that the previous owner, a private limited liability company, had successfully transferred absolute legal and physical possession of the estate to the Aegis conglomerate. He said the corporate handover was executed flawlessly and the $3 million transaction was permanently closed. The team leader told Jamal that his name did not exist on any legal document associated with the land, the house, or the corporate trust. He was nothing more than an unauthorized squatter occupying a secured commercial facility. Jamal stared at the certified legal document in absolute horrified silence. His eyes darted across the bold black text, reading the name of the massive corporate conglomerate and seeing the official state seals. The reality of the situation finally slammed into his brain with the devastating force of a freight train. I had not just changed the locks or transferred the deed to another one of my private holding companies to annoy him. I had actually sold the entire $3 million luxury estate to a ruthless, faceless security corporation out from under him. I had completely liquidated the asset, taken the massive mountain of cash, and legally handed the keys over to a private military firm. Jamal realized with sickening clarity that his grand family reunion was completely destroyed. His church congregation, his mother and his wealthy white in-laws were going to arrive at the gates today, only to find him being thrown out of the property like a common homeless trespasser. His entire fake empire was crumbling into absolute dust. The tactical team leader lowered the document and took another step forward, closing the distance between himself and my terrified husband. He told Jamal that his 15-minute warning had officially begun. He advised Jamal to stop wasting time screaming about marital laws that did not apply to commercial corporate assets. He told Jamal that the local county sheriff department was already staging multiple patrol vehicles just outside the main community entrance. He said if Jamal was not walking off the property with his bags packed in exactly 14 minutes, the tactical team would physically restrain him, apply heavy steel handcuffs, and hand him directly over to the police for felony trespassing. The team leader voice was completely devoid of any pity or hesitation. It was the cold, brutal sound of absolute corporate authority enforcing its legal rights. Jamal opened his mouth to argue again, but the sheer terrifying reality of the armed men standing before him finally crushed his fragile ego into absolute total submission. Jamal turned around and began walking back up the long stone driveway toward the massive luxury house. His shoulders were heavily slumped and his head hung low in utter defeat. The silk robe flapped pathetically around his legs as he dragged his feet across the pavement. He realized that he had no power here. His loud, aggressive behavior, his financial manipulation, and his toxic arrogance meant absolutely nothing against a legally executed commercial real estate transaction and a team of heavily armed guards. He was going to have to walk into the house, pack his cheap suits into a bag, and walk out the front gates carrying nothing but his own massive public humiliation. He thought about the $150,000 he had stolen from my account to bail out Preston's failing business. He realized that without the lake house to prove his wealth and status, he was just a broke, desperate man facing a massive federal criminal investigation. The trap I had meticulously built had finally snapped completely shut, crushing his entire world. High above the lake, Oconee Estate, my private chartered helicopter broke through the scattered morning clouds. I looked down through the large glass window of the aircraft, watching the beautiful, pristine property come into clear view below us. I could see the 3 matte black tactical vehicles blocking the main driveway, perfectly executing the lockdown protocol we had agreed upon. I could see the tiny, pathetic figure of my husband, trudging slowly back toward the house in his ridiculous silk robe, having just been utterly humiliated by the corporate security team. Victoria sat next to me in the helicopter, looking down at the spectacular chaos unfolding below. She smiled a sharp, ruthless smile and handed me my cup of premium espresso. The morning of May 31st was proceeding exactly according to my flawless strategic design. The preliminary skirmish was officially over, and the main event was just about to begin. The true, absolute public destruction of Jamal and his entire toxic family was waiting for me at the front gates, and I was completely ready to deliver the final devastating blow. The clock on the dashboard of my chartered helicopter displayed exactly 1 in the afternoon as we hovered gracefully above the sprawling Georgia landscape. The afternoon sun beat down on the deep green canopy of the surrounding forests, making the surface of Lake Oconee shimmer like crushed diamonds. Looking down through the thick glass window, I could see the quiet country roads leading toward the main entrance of the exclusive gated community. A massive line of vehicles was slowly winding its way down the winding asphalt path, completely disrupting the peaceful atmosphere of the rural area. It was the grand, majestic convoy of my arrogant ex-husband. Jamal had spared absolutely no expense when it came to showing off his fake wealth to his extended family and his gullible church congregation. The line of cars stretched for nearly half a mile, kicking up a thin veil of dust as they approached the primary security checkpoint. At the very front of this ridiculous parade was an oversized white stretch limousine that looked like it belonged at a cheap high school prom rather than a luxury corporate estate. Beatrice had clearly rented the most obnoxious vehicle she could find to transport herself and the senior members of her church. I could almost picture her sitting inside that gaudy limousine, wearing a massive church hat and sipping cheap champagne, while bragging to the elder board about the magnificent house her successful son had purchased for their family. She was likely preparing a self-righteous speech about how she had finally banished her toxic, disrespectful daughter-in-law from their lives. Directly behind the ridiculous limousine was a sleek silver convertible driven by my lazy, entitled sister-in-law Maya. Her white husband Preston sat in the passenger seat wearing designer sunglasses and acting like he owned the entire world. They were leading a line of expensive luxury sedans, carrying Preston's wealthy white parents and their elite suburban friends. Preston had undoubtedly spent the entire morning assuring his family that Jamal was a highly successful financial genius who controlled a massive real estate portfolio. The sheer unearned arrogance radiating from that convoy was absolutely staggering. They were driving toward a brick wall at full speed, and they were completely blinded by their own pathetic vanity. As the convoy reached the main entrance of the neighborhood, the community security guards simply waved them through. The local homeowners association had already been informed that a large group of unauthorized visitors would be arriving, and they had been strictly instructed by local law enforcement to let the vehicles proceed directly to the private gates of the lake house to avoid blocking the public roads. The trap was perfectly set, and the clueless victims were marching happily right into the center of the cage. I leaned back in my leather seat and watched the long line of cars snake its way through the community streets, heading straight toward the massive wrought iron gates of my former property. The scene unfolding at the private entrance of the estate was a masterpiece of absolute total humiliation. The white limousine pulled up to the heavy wrought iron gates and came to a sudden, unexpected halt. The 50 cars trailing behind it were forced to stop, creating a massive, disorganized traffic jam along the narrow private road. The guests inside the vehicles began rolling down their tinted windows, peering out into the warm, humid afternoon air with expressions of deep confusion and mounting frustration. They had expected the gates to swing wide open to welcome them into a luxurious, catered paradise. Instead, they were greeted by the intimidating sight of a locked, impenetrable fortress. On the other side of the tall black metal bars stood Jamal. He was no longer wearing his ridiculous silk robe, but the hastily thrown-on suit he wore looked completely rumpled and soaked with nervous sweat. His chest heaved as he frantically argued with the wall of heavily armed tactical guards blocking the driveway. The 4 men from the corporate security team stood with their feet planted firmly apart, their hands resting casually near their tactical belts, completely ignoring Jamal's desperate, sweaty pleas. The contrast between the heavily armed professional soldiers and my frantic, sweating husband was almost painful to watch. Beatrice rolled down the tinted window of her rented limousine and poked her head out, demanding to know why the gates were not opening for the guest of honor. Her loud, grating voice carried over the sound of idling engines, making the entire situation even more embarrassing. The church elders sitting in the back of the limo began murmuring among themselves, exchanging nervous, uncomfortable glances. This was not the grand, triumphant entry they had been promised. Jamal ran his hands over his face, wiping away the heavy sweat pouring down his forehead. He grabbed the iron bars of the gate and shook them violently, shouting at the security guards to let his mother inside the property. The guards simply stared back at him with cold, blank expressions, their tactical sunglasses reflecting the bright afternoon sun. They did not offer a single word of explanation or sympathy. The guests in the other vehicles were now stepping out of their cars, standing on the hot pavement, and pointing toward the closed gates. The whispering grew louder, turning into a collective buzz of shock and severe disappointment. Maya stepped out of her convertible looking completely mortified as the wealthy white friends of her husband began asking sharp, impatient questions about the delay. The perfect fake image Jamal had spent years meticulously crafting was crumbling to dust in front of his entire congregation and his elite in-laws. He was standing outside his own supposed kingdom, locked out and rejected, while his guests watched him beg like a common, desperate trespasser. The crushing weight of the public embarrassment finally pushed Preston over the edge of rational behavior. His deeply ingrained sense of white privilege and unearned superiority simply could not comprehend a situation where he was denied access to something he wanted. He slammed the door of his silver convertible and marched aggressively up the long line of stopped cars, shoving his way past the confused church members and the murmuring guests. His face was flushed a dark, angry red and his fists were tightly clenched at his sides. Preston marched right up to the heavy wrought iron gates, pushing his way past the rented limousine and stepping directly next to where Jamal was standing. He gripped the metal bars and glared through the gaps at the heavily armed corporate security team. Preston opened his mouth and unleashed a torrent of arrogant, entitled demands, assuming his background and his skin color would instantly command their obedience. He demanded that the guards open the gate immediately or face severe legal consequences. He screamed through the bars, asking if they had any idea who his father was, and threatening to have the entire security firm shut down by the end of the day. Preston shouted that he had a legal constitutional right to be on the premises because his brother-in-law was the primary financial provider of the household. He spouted out more incorrect legal terminology, claiming that marital property laws gave him absolute access to the estate. The sheer volume of his unhinged shouting drew the attention of every single guest standing in the driveway. His wealthy parents watched from their luxury sedan, looking absolutely horrified by their son's public meltdown. Preston continued to scream, insisting that a bitter, jealous woman was just throwing a temper tantrum and interfering with their legal family gathering. He told the tactical guards that they were making a massive career-ending mistake by listening to my unauthorized lockdown request. He ordered them to step aside and let the catering trucks through before he called his powerful attorneys to file massive civil rights lawsuits against the security company. Jamal stood next to Preston, nodding his head and adding his own pathetic demands, trying to ride the coattails of Preston's fake authority. They looked like two desperate, angry children throwing a tantrum outside a candy store that had already closed for the night. Their combined arrogance and complete lack of self-awareness was truly a spectacular sight to behold from the safety of my hovering helicopter. The tactical team leader finally decided he had heard enough of the ridiculous, entitled screaming coming from the other side of the gate. He stepped forward with slow, deliberate movements, radiating a cold, lethal authority that instantly silenced the murmuring crowd of confused guests. The team leader reached to his heavy tactical belt and unclipped a large black megaphone. He raised the device to his mouth and pressed the activation button. A sharp, piercing feedback noise echoed across the driveway, making Preston flinch and step back from the metal bars. The team leader spoke with a deep, booming voice that amplified perfectly over the entire gathering, ensuring that every single person in the massive convoy could hear his exact words. He announced that they were currently attempting to access a private, highly secure corporate facility owned entirely by Aegis Retreats. He explicitly stated that the previous private ownership had been legally terminated, and the property was now under strict commercial lockdown. The team leader voice grew even colder as he delivered his final absolute warning. He declared that anyone attempting to breach the perimeter, damage the gates, or bypass the security checkpoint would be immediately detained and formally arrested for severe felony trespassing. He informed the crowd that local law enforcement had already been dispatched, and multiple county sheriff vehicles were currently blocking the rear exit of the neighborhood, ensuring no one could escape if a breach occurred. A collective gasp of pure horror rippled through the massive crowd of wedding guests and church elders. Beatrice covered her mouth with trembling hands, realizing that her son had dragged their entire congregation into a highly dangerous, illegal situation. Preston's face turned a sickly pale color as the word felony echoed through his mind, suddenly realizing his fake legal threats meant absolutely nothing against a ruthless international corporate entity. Jamal slumped against the iron gates, completely broken and utterly defeated in front of every single person he had ever tried to impress. The sheer magnitude of their failure was finally setting into their stubborn minds. The wealthy suburbanites, who had followed Preston to this destination, began to slowly back away from the front of the crowd, realizing they had been tricked into participating in a severe criminal act. Maya began to sob uncontrollably, leaning against the hood of her convertible, while her rich in-laws glared at her with absolute disgust. The prestigious church elders, who had spent years praising Jamal for his supposed financial genius, were now whispering angrily among themselves, shaking their heads at the massive deception. They were trapped on a narrow road surrounded by dense forest with no way to turn their large vehicles around, and heavily armed guards standing right in front of them. The stifling heat of the afternoon sun only added to the severe misery of the moment, causing expensive makeup to melt and tailored suits to stick uncomfortably to sweating bodies. Jamal looked completely devoid of any remaining dignity, his eyes darting wildly around the property he had tried so desperately to steal from the woman who actually built it. The absolute dead silence that followed the security warning was heavy and suffocating. The guests were too terrified to speak, and the fake kings of the household were completely paralyzed by their own massive public failure. Then the tense, suffocating silence was suddenly shattered by a deep, powerful rumbling sound coming from the vast expanse of water directly behind the massive luxury house. The unmistakable roar of a boat engine echoed across the lake, growing louder with every passing second. The sound cut through the humid air, signaling the final chapter. I had arrived. The deep, powerful roar of the luxury pontoon engine cut through the thick, humid Georgia air, instantly silencing the chaotic screaming at the front gates. I stood at the bow of the sleek vessel, letting the warm summer breeze blow across my face as we approached the private deepwater dock of the Lake Oconee estate. Victoria stood to my right, looking absolutely flawless in her tailored suit, holding her leather briefcase that contained every single document we needed to completely destroy my ex-husband. David, the chief executive officer of Aegis Retreat, stood to my left, radiating quiet corporate authority. As our boat gently bumped against the wooden dock, two heavily armed tactical guards, who had been securing the waterfront perimeter, stepped forward. They immediately recognized David and gave him a crisp, respectful nod before tying the thick mooring lines to the wooden posts. The contrast between this highly organized military precision and the pathetic, messy circus happening at the front of the property was truly beautiful to witness. I stepped off the boat onto the pristine, manicured grass of the sprawling backyard. My emerald green designer suit caught the bright afternoon sunlight, making me look exactly like the multi-million-dollar real estate developer I truly was. I took a deep, cleansing breath of the fresh lake air, feeling an overwhelming sense of profound peace. I began the long, slow walk up the massive, sloping lawn toward the main entrance of the estate. Victoria and David walked casually beside me, forming a wall of absolute legal and corporate power. As we crested the gentle hill, the massive wrought iron front gates finally came into full view. The scene on the other side of those black metal bars was even more pathetic and glorious than I could have ever imagined. 50 luxury cars were jammed together on the narrow private road with no way to turn around or escape the humiliation. Wealthy suburbanites and prestigious church elders were standing on the hot asphalt sweating profusely in their expensive Sunday clothes. Right at the front of the disorganized mob stood the fake king of the household himself. Jamal was gripping the iron bars of the gate with white knuckles, his chest heaving as he stared at the armed guards blocking his path. His cheap suit was wrinkled and stained with nervous sweat. When he saw me crest the hill and walk toward the gates, his entire body went rigid, his jaw dropped open, and his eyes widened in absolute sheer panic. He realized in that exact moment that the minor glitch he thought he was facing was actually a massive, inescapable trap. I continued my slow, deliberate approach, not rushing a single step. I wanted him to feel the heavy, agonizing weight of his impending doom. I wanted his entire church congregation to watch the wealthy, successful woman he had tried to break walking toward him with total unbothered grace. I stopped exactly 10 feet away from the heavy iron gates, maintaining a safe, clean distance from the desperate animals trapped on the other side. I pulled a small bottle of sparkling water from my designer bag, twisted off the cap, and took a slow, refreshing sip. Jamal pressed his face against the metal bars, looking like a trapped, desperate prisoner. His face was twisted in a mixture of blind rage and profound terror. He opened his mouth and started screaming my name through the gaps in the fence. He demanded that I tell these rent-a-cops to open the gates immediately and let his family inside. He shouted that this was marital property, and he had a legal constitutional right to host his family reunion on this estate. He tried to use his loud, booming church voice to command me, but the sound just cracked and faltered in the open air. He looked incredibly small and entirely powerless. I lowered my bottle of sparkling water and looked directly into his panicked, sweating face. The crowd of angry, confused wedding guests and church members fell completely silent, straining their ears to hear my response. I kept my voice perfectly level and ruthlessly cold, ensuring my words carried the absolute weight of undeniable truth. I told Jamal he was deeply confused about his current situation. I explained that he had absolutely no power here and no marital rights to enforce. I told him that I sold this massive luxury house exactly 10 days ago for $3 million in pure cash. I watched his eyes dart wildly back and forth as the reality of my words slammed into his fragile ego. I told him that the property he was trying to break into belonged to a private international security conglomerate. I explained that he was currently trespassing on a heavily guarded corporate facility, wearing a cheap, wrinkled suit, and making an absolute fool of himself in front of his entire congregation. I told him he was nothing but a broke, desperate man trying to show off an empire that never actually belonged to him. The collective gasp that rippled through the massive crowd of trapped guests was absolute music to my ears. The prestigious church elders, who had spent years praising Jamal for his financial genius, began whispering angrily to one another, shaking their heads in deep disgust. They realized they had been dragged out to the middle of nowhere to participate in a massive, pathetic lie. The facade of the wealthy, successful provider was completely shattered into a million tiny, unrecoverable pieces. Beatrice, who had been hiding inside her rented stretch limousine, could no longer contain her toxic, narcissistic rage. The holy church lady persona she had spent decades perfecting evaporated in a single instant. She shoved the limousine door open and stumbled out onto the hot pavement, wearing a massive, ridiculous church hat that looked entirely comical. She pushed her way to the front of the gate, standing next to her disgraced son. Beatrice gripped the iron bars and began shrieking at the top of her lungs. Her face turned a mottled, ugly shade of purple as she hurled vile, disgusting insults through the fence. She called me a wicked, evil woman who was trying to destroy a beautiful, blessed family. She screamed that God would punish me for disrespecting my husband and stealing their generational wealth. I just stood there smiling a calm, pleasant smile as she unraveled completely. I did not interrupt her unhinged screaming. I wanted every single member of her elite church board to see exactly what kind of hateful, vicious woman she truly was behind closed doors. Maya was standing near her silver convertible, sobbing uncontrollably. Her heavy designer makeup was running down her face in thick, dark streaks. Maya was not crying because she felt bad for her brother or because she realized her family was wrong. She was crying because Preston's wealthy white parents and their elite suburban friends were standing right there, witnessing this entire ghetto spectacle unfold. The rich in-laws were looking at Maya and Beatrice with expressions of pure, unfiltered revulsion. They were slowly backing away from the gates, trying to distance themselves from the chaotic screaming and the heavy presence of armed tactical guards. Maya realized that her carefully crafted image of belonging to a successful high-class black family was permanently ruined. She would never be able to show her face at their country club dinners again. Her social climbing dreams were dead and buried right there on the hot asphalt. The sheer volume of public humiliation pushed Preston over the absolute edge of human reason. His deep-seated sense of unearned white privilege completely short-circuited his brain. He could not accept that a black woman was standing on the other side of the gate, holding all the money, all the power, and all the legal authority, while he was stuck outside looking like an idiot. Preston pushed roughly past his crying wife and shoved Jamal out of the way. He marched right up to the iron bars, gripping them so tightly, his knuckles turned completely white. He pointed a shaking, angry finger directly at my face through the narrow gap in the fence. He screamed that I could not do this to them. He shouted that he had personal lawyers who would destroy my entire life and strip me of every single asset I owned. Preston was sweating profusely, his expensive linen suit clinging uncomfortably to his chest. He completely lost control of his mouth and his common sense. Preston yelled through the gates that the $150,000 Jamal had given him was a perfectly legal marital investment. He screamed that it was clean money, and I had absolutely no right to interfere with their business dealings. He proudly announced to the entire crowd that the funds were already secured in his corporate offshore accounts, and there was nothing I could do to get the money back. He thought he was delivering a massive, intimidating threat. He thought he was proving his superior intellect and showing off his untouchable business acumen in front of his wealthy white parents and the shocked church congregation. He had absolutely no idea that he had just handed me the final devastating weapon I needed to end his entire existence. I let his loud, arrogant voice echo across the quiet lakefront, fading slowly into the humid afternoon air. I looked at the tactical guards who were wearing body cameras equipped with high-definition audio recording technology. I looked at the dozens of guests who had pulled out their smartphones and were actively recording this entire public meltdown for their social media accounts. The trap had snapped shut with flawless, lethal precision. I took another slow, deliberate sip of my sparkling water, feeling the cool liquid soothe my throat. I walked one step closer to the gate, looking directly into Preston's pale, terrified eyes. I smiled a warm, gentle, beautiful smile that reached all the way to my eyes. I spoke in a clear, calm voice, making sure every single person in the crowd could hear my exact words. I told Preston I was so incredibly glad he had decided to join this little family gathering today. I told him I was even more thrilled that he had just publicly confessed to receiving that stolen money on camera, in front of 50 independent witnesses. I watched the confusion slowly spread across his arrogant face as my words began to process in his mind. I explained to him that the $150,000 was not a legal marital investment. I told him it was the exact amount of money Jamal had stolen from my private accounts early this morning by committing federal wire fraud and forging my digital signature. I saw the exact moment the blood completely drained from Preston's face, leaving him looking like a sick ghost. His eyes darted to Jamal, who was suddenly looking down at the pavement, unable to make eye contact with his rich brother-in-law. The realization that he was now an active participant in a massive federal financial crime hit Preston with the force of a physical blow. He opened his mouth to stutter out a defensive excuse, but I did not give him the chance to speak. I kept my warm, gentle smile perfectly in place as I pointed a single manicured finger over his shoulder. I told Preston he should stop worrying about my bank accounts and look behind him. Preston turned to look over his shoulder, his posture crumbling as he noticed the silent arrival of his absolute destruction. The narrow private road leading up to the main gates was completely blocked by a sudden influx of law enforcement vehicles. 4 sheriff cruisers with blue and red lights silently flashing had pulled up behind the line of luxury cars and the stretch limousine. Right behind the marked police cruisers were two sleek, unmarked dark sedans. The doors of the unmarked sedans opened simultaneously, and several plainclothes federal agents stepped out onto the hot asphalt. They wore dark suits with their official badges clipped visibly to their belts, and they moved with a level of cold, calculated authority that made the armed corporate security guards look almost friendly by comparison. The federal agents ignored the confused crowd of guests as they moved forward with intense, relentless purpose. Their eyes were locked firmly onto their two primary high-profile targets. The appearance of federal law enforcement sent a wave of terror rippling through the crowd of guests and church elders. The congregation members were now pressing themselves against their vehicles, trying to distance themselves from Jamal and his toxic family. Beatrice stopped her unhinged screaming and stared at the approaching federal agents with wide, horrified eyes. She clutched her ridiculous church hat as if it could somehow protect her from the massive legal storm that was about to obliterate her entire world. Maya let out a loud, terrified sob and buried her face in her hands, completely unable to watch the inevitable downfall of her fake empire. The local county sheriff deputies moved first. They bypassed the confused, wealthy suburbanites and marched straight up to the heavy wrought iron gates where Jamal was standing. Jamal was sweating profusely, his silk robe clinging to his chest, as he took a pathetic step backward. One of the local deputies informed Jamal that he was being officially detained for severe felony trespassing and disturbing the peace. Jamal opened his mouth to argue, trying to talk his way out of the arrest, but the deputies were not interested in hearing his fake legal theories. They grabbed Jamal by the arms, spun him around, and slammed him roughly against the iron bars of the gate. The sound of the heavy metal handcuffs clicking shut around his wrists echoed loudly across the quiet lakefront. Jamal began crying instantly, tears streaming down his face as he begged the deputies to let him go. He pleaded, saying he was a respectable bank manager, but his desperate words meant absolutely nothing. The deputies dragged Jamal away from the gates, parading him in his rumpled suit and silk robe, right past his deeply disgusted church congregation. His fake public image was permanently destroyed in front of every single person he had ever tried to impress. While the local police were busy handling my pathetic ex-husband, the plainclothes federal agents walked with lethal precision straight toward Preston. Preston stood frozen next to his silver convertible, his face completely drained of all color. His wealthy parents stepped out of their luxury sedan behind him, looking incredibly confused and deeply concerned. His father demanded to know what was going on, trying to intimidate the federal investigators. The lead federal agent did not even look at Preston's parents. He walked directly up to Preston and pulled out a heavy pair of steel handcuffs. "Preston Vance," the federal agent said, his voice carrying clearly over the dead silence of the crowd. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit federal wire fraud and receiving stolen commercial funds." Preston's legs completely gave out beneath him. He tried to stammer a pathetic excuse, claiming that he had no idea the $150,000 was stolen money. He tried to throw Jamal under the bus, pointing his finger at my ex-husband, who was currently being shoved into a police cruiser. But the federal agents did not care about his cowardly excuses. They grabbed Preston by the shoulders and slammed him forcefully against the pristine hood of his leased silver Porsche. The loud metallic thud made his wealthy parents gasp in pure horror. Preston's mother began screaming frantically, demanding that the agents release her son immediately. She yelled that they were making a massive mistake and that her son was a successful technology entrepreneur who would never commit a financial crime. The lead federal agent simply turned his head and advised her to step back and contact a criminal defense attorney because her son was going to federal prison for a very long time. Preston began to sob uncontrollably, crying like a terrified child, as the agent secured the heavy handcuffs tightly around his wrists. His inherent white privilege and his unearned sense of superiority had completely vanished, leaving nothing but a broke, desperate criminal facing severe federal charges. The elite suburban friends who had followed Preston to the lake house were now frantically getting back into their vehicles, desperate to escape the massive public humiliation. They realized that Preston was not a wealthy, successful businessman, but a pathetic fraud who had dragged them into a federal crime scene. Maya watched her husband being dragged away by the federal agents and let out a piercing, agonizing scream. She realized that her comfortable, lazy life was permanently over. The offshore cryptocurrency accounts were frozen, the leased sports cars would be repossessed, and her rich white in-laws would absolutely blame her for dragging their precious son into a massive financial scandal. She was going to lose her fake high-class status, and she would never be welcomed back into their elite suburban circles. The ultimate social climber had just fallen all the way down to the very bottom of the social ladder, and the impact was absolutely devastating. As the police cruisers and the unmarked federal sedans began loading up their prisoners, the remaining crowd of guests stood in absolute stunned silence. The prestigious church elders, who had spent years praising Jamal for his traditional family values, were now looking at Beatrice with expressions of pure, unfiltered revulsion. They realized that Beatrice had actively supported her son as he stole money and committed federal crimes just to fund a ridiculous fake family reunion. The church members began climbing back into their vehicles, wanting absolutely nothing to do with the toxic, corrupt family they had once admired. Beatrice realized that her entire world had just been completely obliterated in the span of 15 minutes. The fake Holy Church lady persona she had spent decades meticulously crafting was permanently destroyed. Her golden child was sitting in the back of a police car facing severe trespassing charges and a massive federal wire fraud investigation. Her daughter was sobbing on the hot pavement facing total financial ruin and a brutal divorce from her wealthy in-laws. Beatrice had absolutely nothing left. Her social standing, her financial security, and her arrogant pride were completely gone. She fell heavily to her knees on the hot, dusty pavement right outside the massive wrought iron gates. The rough gravel tore at the expensive fabric of her designer dress, but she did not even seem to notice the physical pain. She looked through the metal bars at me, standing perfectly composed on the pristine, manicured lawn of the luxury estate she had tried so desperately to steal. Beatrice threw her hands in the air and began wailing with a loud, desperate, ugly sound. The tears streaming down her face were no longer fake or manipulative. They were the genuine, agonizing tears of a woman who had finally realized the catastrophic consequences of her own toxic greed. She looked up at me, her face twisted in pure desperation. She begged me to call the police and tell them it was all a massive misunderstanding. She pleaded with me to use my wealth and my corporate connections to save her son from federal prison. "We are family!" she screamed, her voice cracking with absolute terror. "You cannot do this to us. You cannot destroy us like this. We are your family." I took a slow, deliberate step toward the heavy iron gates, closing the distance until I was looking directly down at the pathetic, broken woman kneeling in the dirt. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or remorse for her sudden downfall. I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, profound sense of permanent justice. I looked closely at the woman who had made my life absolutely miserable for 4 long, agonizing years. This was the very same woman who had constantly belittled my career, insulted my character, and praised her son for stealing my hard-earned money. This was the woman who thought she could simply walk into my home pack, my designer clothes into trash bags, and kick me out onto the street. I looked down at her miserable, weeping face and prepared to deliver the absolute final blow to her shattered reality. Beatrice was kneeling in the dirt, sobbing hysterically and begging me for mercy. Her tears were completely pathetic. I stood perfectly still on the manicured green grass, looking down at the toxic woman who had spent 4 years trying to make me feel small. I did not reach out to comfort her. I did not offer a single word of sympathy. I looked directly into her red, swollen eyes and delivered the absolute final blow to her shattered reality. I told Beatrice she had always wanted a submissive, traditional daughter-in-law who would blindly let her son steal from her. I explained that she wanted a weak woman she could control and manipulate using fake religious guilt. I said instead she got a highly educated, successful woman who knows exactly what she is worth. I told her she spent years praising a son who was nothing but a financial parasite, and now she gets to watch him go to federal prison. I suggested she use her remaining breath to pray for a good defense attorney. I turned my back on her and coldly told her to enjoy her Uber ride back to her miserable suburban life. Beatrice let out another loud, agonizing wail and collapsed forward onto the hot asphalt, completely broken and utterly defeated. While Beatrice was crying in the dirt, a new chaotic scene was unfolding near the front of the massive wrought iron gates. The local police needed to clear the private driveway to transport Jamal to the county jail, but Maya's silver convertible was completely blocking the exit path. A local sheriff deputy ordered Maya to move her vehicle immediately. Maya was shaking uncontrollably as she tried to explain that her husband Preston had the keys in his pocket and he was currently sitting handcuffed in the back of a federal sedan. The deputy did not care about her excuses. He signaled for a heavy-duty tow truck to move the luxury car out of the way. The tow truck driver informed Maya that there would be a massive impound fee to release the vehicle and she needed to provide a credit card on file right now to process the emergency service. Maya frantically dug through her designer handbag, pulling out a thick stack of premium credit cards. She handed the first card to the driver with trembling hands, trying desperately to maintain some shred of her fake high-class dignity in front of the watching crowd. The driver swiped the card through his mobile terminal. The machine beeped loudly and flashed a red declined message. Maya's face turned a bright panicked shade of red. She grabbed another card and handed it over, claiming there must be a simple banking error. The driver swiped the second card. Declined. He swiped a third card. Declined. Maya began to panic, breathing heavily, as the harsh reality of her situation finally hit her. She had absolutely no idea that every single credit card in her wallet was directly linked to Jamal's primary bank accounts. She did not know that federal investigators had completely frozen every single asset associated with her brother pending the massive wire fraud investigation. She had absolutely nothing left. The wealthy lifestyle she had enjoyed for years was instantly wiped out. The tow truck driver rolled his eyes and hooked the heavy metal chains to the front axle of her pristine convertible. Maya stood on the side of the road, crying hysterically as her expensive car was dragged away, leaving her stranded in the middle of nowhere with a frozen bank account and a husband facing severe federal charges. She had tried to steal my diamond watch this morning, and now she did not even have enough money to buy a bottle of water. The local police finally managed to clear a path through the chaotic mess of vehicles and distressed wedding guests. Two broad-shouldered officers grabbed Jamal by the arms and began marching him toward the back of a marked patrol cruiser. Jamal was no longer screaming or fighting. All the fight had been completely drained out of him. His cheap silk robe was dirty, and his bare feet were bleeding slightly from the rough pavement. He looked like an absolute hollow shell of the arrogant man who had tried to intimidate me just a few hours ago. He was crying silently, tears streaming down his face as he realized his entire fake empire was gone forever. As the officers prepared to push Jamal into the back seat of the police car, Victoria stepped smoothly out from behind me. My brilliant attorney walked confidently up to the police cruiser, holding a crisp manila folder in her hands. She did not ask for permission to approach. The officers recognized her sharp legal authority and paused for a brief moment. Victoria looked at Jamal with an expression of pure professional disgust. She pulled a thick stack of freshly filed legal documents from the folder. These were the official absolute divorce petitions we had finalized in my penthouse suite. She slid the heavy stack of papers right into Jamal's handcuffed hands. Jamal looked down at the documents, his eyes widening in fresh horror as he read the bold legal print. Victoria smiled a cold, ruthless smile. She told Jamal he was officially being served. She advised him to read the documents carefully because they outlined exactly how he was going to walk away from this marriage with absolutely zero assets and a massive mountain of debt. She leaned in close and delivered the final perfect message. "Sign these in prison, Jamal," she said, her voice carrying clearly over the idling police engines. The officers pushed Jamal down into the back seat and slammed the heavy door shut. Jamal pressed his face against the reinforced glass, looking back at me with an expression of absolute despair. The police cruiser slowly pulled away from the gates, its bright lights flashing as it drove down the private road, carrying my toxic ex-husband out of my life forever. The departure of the police and federal agents broke the spell holding the crowd captive. The fake friends and church elders snapped back to reality. They realized they were standing in the middle of an active crime scene, and none of them wanted to be associated with the spectacular downfall of Jamal and his family. Absolute panic erupted among the crowd as people scrambled to get back into their luxury vehicles. They pushed and shoved each other, desperate to escape the severe public embarrassment. Engines roared to life and tires squealed against the pavement as the convoy of cars hastily reversed and fled down the narrow country road. The church members who had spent years praising Beatrice and Jamal were now fleeing the scene like frightened rats abandoning a sinking ship. Within 10 minutes, the entire area outside the main gates was completely empty. The only things left behind were discarded party decorations and the lingering smell of exhaust fumes. The quiet, peaceful atmosphere of the lakefront property slowly began to return. I turned around and looked at the 4 heavily armed tactical guards standing firmly at their posts. They gave me a crisp, respectful nod, acknowledging the hostile threat had been completely neutralized. David, the chief executive officer of Aegis Retreats, stepped forward and extended his hand. He thanked me for an incredibly smooth and entertaining real estate transaction. I shook his hand firmly, knowing I had secured a brilliant, powerful new corporate ally. Victoria bumped her shoulder against mine and smiled, her eyes shining with pure professional satisfaction. We had executed a flawless legal and financial trap, destroying the people who tried to destroy me. I turned my back on the massive wrought iron gates and began walking slowly back down the pristine green lawn of the beautiful luxury estate I had built and successfully liquidated. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting a warm golden glow across the deep blue water. I walked onto the private wooden dock where the sleek luxury pontoon was waiting for us. I stepped onto the boat and took a seat at the bow, letting the warm summer breeze wash over my face. The boat engine roared to life and we slowly pulled away from the shore, leaving the massive $3 million house far behind us. I did not shed a single tear for the marriage I had lost. I did not feel a single ounce of regret for the absolute destruction I had caused. I looked out at this endless expanse of water, feeling a deep, profound sense of pure, undeniable peace. I had completely reclaimed my power, my dignity, and my absolute freedom. I was a highly successful, independent woman with a brilliant future and a $3 million cash balance sitting safely in my private bank account. The toxic noise of the past was finally silenced forever, and my new beautiful life was just beginning. True family is not determined by blood or marital ties, but by mutual respect and genuine support. You cannot buy love or approval from people who only see you as a financial resource when toxic people try to manipulate or control your hard-earned success. You must establish firm boundaries and protect your peace at all costs. Walking away from ungrateful relatives is not an act of cruelty, but a necessary step toward self-preservation and authentic happiness. Never let anyone diminish your worth or force you into a submissive role just to maintain a fake illusion of perfect harmony. If you have ever cut off toxic family members to protect your peace, please share your story in the comments below and subscribe for more empowering content.